there, good afternoon, and welcome to my presentation, which is entitled Beyond the Binary, Transcending the Native Speaker Construct in Global ELT. My name is Raghav Venkatesh, and I'm a lecturer at the University of the West of Scotland. I'm also a PhD student there. I'd like to begin this afternoon by offering some definitions of what native speakerism is. Though the scholarship on native speakerism predates Holliday's definition, it's his definition that seems to have endured, and he defines it as an established belief that native speaker teachers represent a Western culture from which spring the ideals both of the English language and of English language teaching methodology. While this is a reasonable definition that I think adequately captures how native speakerism manifests in many contexts, I do prefer Houghton and Rivers' definition because I think it's broader, more nuanced, and less universalist in terms of capturing things like the role that non-native teachers and administrators might play in perpetuating native speakerism, as well as the fact that native speakers may also experience things like objectification and stereotyping. Still, what is common between both definitions and the overarching focal point of this presentation is the idea that native speakers are just superior linguistic models and consequently superior language teachers, an idea that we can call the native speaker construct. And that idea is deeply, deeply ingrained. I could probably spend a whole other presentation doing a critical discourse analysis of YouTube videos such as these, but I'll limit myself here to saying that the native speaker construct is clearly embedded in discourses of desire and aspiration, even fetishization, because speaking English like a native indexes a number of things, including confidence, success, sophistication, even modernity. And so the remainder of this presentation will delve into the findings of a study that I carried out a few years ago, which involved semi-structured interviews with 4 ELT professionals of various backgrounds and teaching in different contexts to understand how they conceptualize and experience the phenomenon of native speakerism. So we have Adam, who is a Caucasian male native English-speaking teacher from England, who teaches English in the Czech Republic. Ijaz is a South Asian male nest from Scotland who teaches English in Saudi Arabia. Vasudha is a South Asian female, non-native English-speaking teacher from India who teaches English in Australia. And finally, Jimena is a Caucasian female non-native teacher of Spanish and Latin American descent who teaches English in Spain. I want to quickly point out that while I've chosen to use terms like native and non-native, as well as nest and non-nest throughout this presentation for the sake of convenience, I do acknowledge that these are contested terms and are based on perceived rather than actual categories. Well, with that said, I'd like to explore some of the salient themes that emerged from this research. The first recurring motif was that of identity and the complexities that come with it, as Jimena illustrates here. She says, obviously, students see my name, Jimena Rodriguez, that is very Spanish. After a couple of days, they ask me, but Jimena, are you British or are you Spanish? Because explicitly, you wouldn't say. I could be from wherever, to be honest. Jimena's quote makes it apparent that identity is an increasingly complex phenomenon that does not lend itself to simple categorization due to what Norton calls the cultures of hybridity that are characteristic of late modernity. Indeed, all of the participants can, to differing extents, be said to possess hybridized cultural and linguistic identities. For some, it's quite obvious how this is the case, but even for those that it's less obvious, like Adam, for instance, who isn't quoted on this slide, but who you might assume, being a white native speaker from England, has quite a straightforward linguistic or cultural identity. Even he defies straightforward categorization, positioning himself as an EU citizen and leaning into his multilingualism as someone who has been learning Czech for 10 years. So the question, rather, of identity is a complex one. A key feature of post-structuralist understandings of identity, such as Hall's, which I've included here, is that identities are not fixed a priori categories, but rather points of temporary attachment, as he puts it, that are discursively constructed. In other words, they should be understood in relational rather than essentialist terms. For instance, even if Ijaz in this quote here self-identifies as a British Asian, he still experiences a heightened sense of his Britishness when he's teaching in Saudi Arabia, as he says, the Asian part is sort of eliminated. But conversely, he also experiences a heightened sense of his Asianness when he's in the UK. And so participants occupy what Baba terms cultural and linguistic third spaces, where they're not simply products of one culture or another, but rather each in their own way possess unique hybridized traits, which challenges binary conceptualizations of reality, including the native-non-native dichotomy. And when we consider Vasudha's ambiguity over her relationship with English as to whether it is her first or second language, we can see that supposedly clear-cut categories such as native and non-native are often an inaccurate and inadequate way of conceptualizing identity. A similar linguistic ambiguity is embodied by Jimena's quote from the previous slide, demonstrating that in multicultural and particularly post-colonial contexts, linguistic identity is far from straightforward. Another recurring theme from the research was that of culture and its significance to the teaching of English. This is how Ijaz understands the relationship between the two. He says, talking about the very much British-centric curriculum that he teaches in Saudi Arabia, there's a lot of stuff like red buses, red telephone boxes. We've lived this culture and it can come through, I suppose, firsthand. So this would be my speakerism, bringing the books to life, if you want to call it that. Ijaz's comments here about bringing the book to life point towards another key element of native speakerism that also finds place in Holliday's definition that we looked at in the previous slide, namely the idea that native English teachers are able to represent and transmit a Western culture in a way that non-native teachers simply can't. It's important to say here that it isn't so much that teachers like Ijaz or even Adam deliberately lean into their nativeness to distinguish themselves from non-native teachers. The fact of the matter is, as I will touch on in a subsequent slide, that most English language programs around the world rely heavily on standardized coursebooks, which, as Adam points out in this quote, are written from a Western orientation and are culturally biased towards a purported British or, in some cases, American culture. When this is the case and learners are inundated with aspirational cultural depictions of the West, it is perhaps unsurprising that native-speaking teachers are valorized as representatives of that culture. And to the extent that these course books sometimes also contain stereotypical or reductive representations of other cultures, it raises concerns, as Gray suggests, about the erasure of certain identity positions for both non-native teachers as well as for learners from these officially endorsed versions of reality, of social reality, which is why for Jimena, there is a need to specifically address these issues to students, making sure they understand that being from a particular place or having a particular accent does not necessarily make someone a good teacher. Importantly, when teachers don't have the responsibility of being cultural carriers, they can be evaluated solely by their professional qualities and not their personal backgrounds. Participants were also asked about the variety of English that they speak and whether they ever altered the way that they speak in the classroom. Adam's response here is indicative of how certain varieties and accents may be more valorized than others. He says, the thing that I can deliver in terms of my identity is a kind of Englishness, which they often associate with the BBC. There's a sort of association with being a little more serious, perhaps, or even, to some degree more eloquent, even though I'm not saying anything different or using any different vocabulary. It's worth noting here that Adam identifies the variety of English that he speaks owing to his upbringing in the south of England as standard English, which as a result of its enregistrement has come to represent the normative and unaccented way of speaking, indexing prestige and a certain white middle classness. That being the case, it's easy to understand why the same words coming from him sound more important and why non-native teachers may want to emulate his and other prestigious ways of speaking. This evokes Baba's work on mimicry, a colonial discourse that is based on the colonizer's desire to have the colonized emulate or mimic their linguistic and cultural practices, but not emulate them so well that the difference between the colonizer and the colonized is no longer intelligible. For Baba, mimicry has potentially subversive connotations as well, because the colonized performing the signs and symbols of coloniality, in this case, native English accents, can reveal those very signs to be hollow and superficial, and mimicry can almost become mockery. Applying this to native speakerism, which in many ways is a neo-colonial discourse, if Himina, in her quote here, can speak with a British accent and sound more British than the British, then this disrupts the exclusivity of Britishness that native speakerism is premised on, even though this may not have been her intention. The intention that she does cite for modifying her accent is to achieve higher integration within a particular social group. But this could well constitute what Pillar calls linguistic passing, as derived from racial passing, which is a practice through which a non-native speaker may accrue the cultural capital associated with native speakerhood by speaking in a way that lets them pass for a native speaker. It's worth asking, for example, whether Himina would also emulate a Nigerian or Hong Kong English accent in her stated interests of achieving better integration. It would seem that this pressure to sound different isn't as pronounced, if you'll pardon the pun, for native speakers like Ijaz. While he does talk about modifying his speech slightly, mainly to ensure that his quote-unquote thick Scottish accent can be understood by students, he stresses that trying to copy somebody else's way of speaking can easily be detected as fake and open teachers up to ridicule. However, the double-edged sword for non-native teachers is that sometimes continuing to speak in their own accents may also lead to ridicule. And so Cook is quite right in saying that the denial of the right of L2 users to sound as if they come from a particular place is an issue of power. Another theme that participants reflected on was finding themselves pigeonholed in rigid categories of race and speakerhood, as Vasudha recounts here. She says there was this guy called Bob who was CEO at that time of a company that she used to work at, and he was like, Vasudha, I'm just intrigued. Where did you learn your English? They tell me you're from India. So I said, why does that come as a shock to you or as a surprise or what is it? So he says, no, I'm very curious. Tell me, did you go to a special school? Now, despite the complimentary connotation here about Vasudha's English, Bob reproduces the trope that Indians are not legitimate speakers of English, that speaking English and being Indian are mutually exclusive in a way that only going to a special school can reconcile this apparent contradiction. This is an example of what Aneja terms non-native speakering, where individuals are discursively constructed as being native or non-native speakers through institutional mechanisms and social negotiations based on their perceived characteristics, which includes things like race and nationality. Consider this anecdote from Himina, for example, about how one of the teachers at her school is discursively constructed as a non-native speaker before even walking through the door, solely on the basis of her name, which suggests a Hispanic ethnicity. This perpetuates the trope that only white native speakers speak real English, and according to Kubota and Lin, reifies the essentialized dichotomy of native speaker equals standard English speaker equals white versus non-native speaker equals non-standard English speaker equals non-white. It's also worth remembering that the existence of enduring tropes about certain speaker groups can affect how individuals belonging to those groups are perceived. And as During et al. Explain, a listener's stereotypical perceptions can contribute to breakdowns in communication as much as a speaker's utterances can. The well-established stereotype about Indian call center employees being difficult to understand that Vasudha mentions is a good example of this, because those who hold this view are likely to conflate Indian accentedness with unintelligibility. Yet another theme that emerged from participants' responses was the impact of the marketization of ELT. In this quote, Adam reflects on the commodification of native speakerhood itself in order to appeal to the global ELT customer base. He says, we're pre-programmed by our consumerist society that we live in to kind of buy into all of these notions of packaging and product and purity or whatever. So unfortunately, you're dealing with one of the sides or one of probably the priorities of education, which is to create all humans in the classroom into willing and obliging consumers. And the consumerism element feeds into speakerism. Adam is essentially describing how the commodification of nativeness by institutions and employers influences market perceptions, legitimizing demand for native speaking teachers, which in turn feeds back into the supply chain. Himina echoes this idea, commenting on the fact that while it's unlawful to discriminate based on certain protected characteristics like gender and age, but also race, there is no such restriction on promoting native speakerhood. Marketing nativeness in this way turns it into a brand or intangible asset with tremendous value, and in doing so, obscures the ideological nature of native speakerism by rendering it in purely economic terms. Thus, similar to how Rooker borrows the concept whiteness as property from critical race theory to deconstruct native speakerism, we can also employ the frame nativeness as property to describe how the Bordeauxian symbolic capital derived from native speakerhood implicitly confers certain socioeconomic advantages, including greater visibility and penetration in the jobs market. Another major implication of the marketization of ELT is the near ubiquitous role that commercially produced ELT materials play in classrooms around the world. Adam, who isn't quoted on this slide, explains how, despite his reluctance to rely on textbooks, he's obligated to purchase and deliver the entire suite of Cambridge materials because of cultural expectations. Similarly, Ijaz describes how the curriculum he teaches is structured around a course book that effectively doubles up as a lesson plan, telling teachers what to do as well as what not to do. This is a key part of what Kumara Vadivelu terms method, namely the fundamentally Western concept that governs how ELT is done around the world, which he describes as a top-down, one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter approach that diminishes the agency of teachers and ignores the particularities of the context where it is being utilized. In other words, this is pedagogy created by the native speaker for the native speaker. And Kumara Vadivelu rightly asks how this does anything but perpetuate native speakerism. Finally, a number of comments made by participants offered key insights into how the hegemony of native speakers in ELT is sustained and reproduced. Speaking about what advice she would give to a non-native teacher applying for a job that stipulates native teachers, she says the following: I would tell my students, go ahead and apply for the job. Just explain that you're not a native, but that you have an educational background and you're more than ready to do the job. Explain that you are not a native speaker, but you are quasi-native or you are native-like, and that you can prove that you can be as good as a native. While this advice was clearly intended to be empowering for non-native teachers, it implicitly normalizes the privileged position that native speakers occupy in the hierarchy of language teachers, requiring non-native teachers to heavily foreground their educational qualifications and their preparedness to do the job, as well as to prove their worth in terms of being quasi-native or native-like. This is a striking example of the Gramscian notion of hegemony, where power is exercised not through coercion, but through the naturalization of the dominant class's practices, in this case, their linguistic practices, and the consent of the majority to go along with the arrangements that flow from that power. Thus, when Adam suggests that it is almost inevitable that a person applying for a job as a language teacher would be a native speaker, this is a clear indication that native speakerism has become what Fairclough calls a dominant order of discourse, namely a set of discursive practices that have become institutionalized and gained acceptance as non-ideological common sense notions. Another dominant order of discourse about native speakerism is that it is too deeply embedded a phenomenon to be uprooted, as embodied by Ijaz's ambivalence as he reflects on how, despite personally disagreeing with native speakerism, he has to reluctantly accept the benefits of native speakerism, having himself responded to a job advertisement stipulating native teachers. Elsewhere, not quoted on the slide, he attempts to justify native speakerism as being intuitive, saying, if you want to learn a certain language, you go to the users of the language. Those people who know the language really well are those who are born into the language, while at the same time stressing that non-native teachers are really good, but that the skill sets are different. These can all be interpreted as discursive strategies to rationalize the existence of native speakerism, despite clearly feeling uncomfortable about it. However, as Cook points out, being a native speaker of a language is nothing more or less than the unalterable historic fact of which language one was born and primarily socialized into. And so it is ideological to construe linguistic ownership by birth as the most legitimate relationship between a language and its users, as Ortega says, especially for an international language like English. So where does that leave us in terms of conclusions and future directions? Well, firstly, the existence of native speaker hegemony, or the tyranny of the native speaker, as Jimenez terms it, constitutes a challenge to equality and professionalism in ELT, because as she points out, and as Adam echoes, it is based on fallacious logic and has no pedagogical basis. Native speakerism is based on stereotypical perceptions of non-native teachers, but also of native teachers. It disenfranchises non-native teachers while commodifying native teachers, turning them into bottleable products, as Adam puts it. And also, as Ijaz says, ignoring the complexities of who they really are as individuals and as teachers. It therefore makes sense to stop thinking about teacher identity in binaries or homogeneous group identities, and instead adopt the frames of hybridity and thirdness as defined by Baba and other scholars as an antidote to essentialism and stereotyping about who is and is not a canonical speaker of English. It also makes sense to relocate the target culture of ELT so that language teaching is not accompanied by a purported and highly fetishized native culture and informed instead by ideas of critical multiculturalism or interculturality, so that teachers don't have to act as cultural agents. In this regard, it would also be beneficial to break away from the oligopoly of commercially mass-produced center-based teaching materials and instead facilitate more contextually sensitive pedagogy, which includes empowering non-native teachers to produce their own socially conscious materials. Finally, as Vasudha suggests here, English can no longer be claimed exclusively by any one country, and it is increasingly untenable to refer to native and non-native speakers of what is truly an international language, which makes those labels redundant and worthy of being abandoned. So it is, in the end, it's as Mark Twain says, there is no such thing as the Queen's English. The property has gone into the hands of a joint stock company, and we own the bulk of the shares. But if I could just repurpose that quote ever so slightly to say, there is no such thing as the native speaker's English, the property has gone into the hands of a multinational company, and we own the bulk of the shares. Thank you very much for listening, and I think I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.